It was a blistering Monday morning when I watched the sprinkler heads sputter and die mid-spray, a pitiful hiss breaking the silence, and within minutes, my once lush garden wilted under the merciless sun. I stood there, hose in hand, blinking in confusion until my neighbor rushed over, breathless and panicked, waving a letter from the HOA. They had cut my water supply. Not warned. Not asked. Just cut it. And here was the kicker. I was not even part of the HOA. As I read the smug notice stamped with threats and fines, a slow, boiling rage crept through my veins. They had no idea the pipe they severed was not just watering my tomatoes. It was feeding their precious fountains, their resort-style pools, and their manicured lawns. By the time they realized their mistake, I would be standing on a throne built from their dead begonias and sun-scorched dreams. The moment I grasped the situation, the pettiness of it all made me laugh out loud. It was so perfectly stupid it was almost impressive. I marched toward my backyard where the main water line ran, a rugged setup installed decades ago that connected a private well hidden deep in the woods to several properties. When the developers built the HOA subdivision next door, they brokered a deal with the original landowners for water rights. A deal I inherited when I bought this land. They needed me far more than I needed them, and they had just declared war without realizing they were standing knee-deep in a swamp with no lifeboats. An aggressive knock rattled my front door. I opened it to find Karen herself, the self-appointed queen of the HOA board, lips puckered tight enough to squeeze blood from a lemon. She pushed a paper toward me without so much as a hello. It was a violation notice. Trespassing. Unauthorized water use. Failure to comply with HOA landscaping guidelines. I stared at her, then the paper, then her again. It would have been hilarious if it were not so insulting. I said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch until her smugness wavered. Then I asked in the calmest voice I could manage if she realized I was not a member of her HOA. Her face twitched, but she plowed ahead with legalese she clearly half understood, babbling about community standards and uniform compliance. I let her rant, watching her dig the hole deeper. Finally, when she wound down enough to breathe, I simply said, "I am not under your jurisdiction. You have made a huge mistake." Instead of apologizing or even considering she was wrong, Karen doubled down. She insisted that because my property bordered theirs, I was obligated to join. I almost laughed again. She did not know it, but not only was I not part of their HOA, I was the sole owner of the private well feeding the entire community water system. Their dependency was buried underground, invisible and forgotten. Until now. After she left, huffing and threatening to call her lawyer, I went into action. I dug out my copy of the original deed and water rights agreement. Pages yellowed with age but ironclad in legal language. I traced the lines on the map and smiled grimly. The HOA's water infrastructure tied directly to my private supply. And without my consent, no alternative existed. They had not just picked the wrong fight. They had detonated a bomb under their own foundation. Still, I decided to give them a sporting chance. I called an emergency meeting with the HOA board. They showed up looking confident, even smug. Karen led the charge, brandishing a clipboard like it was a sword. I let them talk first. They accused me of stealing water, of damaging community property, of being a hostile neighbor. I let them pile accusation after accusation until their words blurred into noise. Then I placed the documents in front of them. The room fell silent. Karen grabbed the papers first, her hand trembling slightly. I pointed to the critical lines. Private water rights. Non-HOA land. Mandatory access granted only with written permission and fee agreement. Without me, they had no legal access to any water source. Their mouths opened and closed like fish on dry land. I informed them that by cutting my water line without notice or permission, they had not only trespassed, they had committed vandalism and interfered with a legal water utility. I was within my rights to shut off supply entirely. Today. Right now. Their faces paled as the gravity sank in. Karen tried to bluster, but her voice cracked. She knew. They all knew. I walked out without another word, leaving them scrambling and shouting behind me. The sun was setting, casting long, golden rays across my now dry garden. It would survive a few days without water. Their golf course lawns, their Olympic-sized pools, their elaborate fountains and imported flower beds? Not so much. By tomorrow, they would start to understand the mistake they made. By the end of the week, they would be on their knees. As I turned the shut-off valve to my private well with a satisfying click, I felt no guilt. Only anticipation. They had declared war. But I was the one holding the water cannon. By the next morning, the consequences of their arrogance started to bloom across the neighborhood like a plague. It began subtly, almost laughably, as confused residents stood on their perfectly manicured lawns, watching their automated sprinklers sputter and cough nothing but air. The usually pristine sidewalks were dusted with crumbling yellow grass, and the complaints started rolling into the HOA office faster than Karen could answer them. I sat on my porch sipping coffee, watching them scurry back and forth like ants trying to plug a dam with leaves. I had no reason to rush. They had made their move first. I was simply letting nature and gravity do their jobs. I decided to take a walk through the subdivision just to admire the slow-motion train wreck unfolding. I passed by Mr. Thornby's house, where his precious rose garden, a 5-time winner of the neighborhood landscaping contest, already looked less regal under the high morning sun. He stood there in horror, garden hose hanging uselessly from his hand, as he fiddled with the tap that produced nothing but a low groan. Farther down the street, the HOA Community Park's fountain, usually a showpiece of gurgling elegance, was now a dry stone shell, the little statues of dolphins and cherubs awkwardly exposed and sad without their spouts of dancing water. It would have been poetic if it had not been so satisfyingly hilarious. When I reached the clubhouse, the scene was even better than I imagined. A group of board members, including Karen, were frantically gathered around the central water control system, manuals and phones in hand, as they tried to troubleshoot the issue. A plumber's van was already parked nearby, a harried-looking technician explaining something with wild hand gestures while Karen shook her head stubbornly. From the bits I overheard, it was clear they still had not figured it out. They assumed it was a technical failure, a burst pipe maybe, or faulty pump. Not one of them had considered the simple truth. They had angered the man who owned their lifeline. Later that afternoon, I went back to my house and pulled out the old water utility agreements again. I wanted to be absolutely sure before the situation escalated even more. There it was, plain as day. The developer had struck a deal decades ago because the subdivision land did not have adequate water sources. My property had the well and the rights to the underground aquifer. The HOA paid a private maintenance fee to the original owner, which had transferred to me with the deed. Not a public service, not a county supply, but a private one. In fact, without my cooperation, their entire setup was illegal. It was the kind of oversight that could topple an entire board and potentially leave every homeowner scrambling for solutions that would take years and thousands of dollars to fix. I made copies of everything, knowing full well that Karen would not go down without a fight. This was a woman who thought power came from barking orders louder than anyone else. She would double down, triple down even, before admitting defeat. But facts were not on her side, and I had all the time in the world. That evening, the first real cracks in their facade showed. My phone rang off the hook. I let it go to voicemail, each message more desperate and pathetic than the last. Karen demanding a meeting. Mr. Thornby pleading for a temporary reconnection. Even the HOA's treasurer leaving a rambling apology, suggesting that perhaps a misunderstanding had occurred and surely we could come to some friendly resolution. I turned my phone off and smiled. They were not ready to deal yet. Not until they truly felt the pinch. The next morning, things got worse for them. I heard the news before I even left my house. The community pool, pride of the neighborhood, was closed indefinitely. Without fresh water circulating, it had started turning into a green, mosquito-infested swamp overnight. The maintenance crew refused to work without water access, citing health and safety concerns. Parents were furious because it was the start of summer vacation. Kids who had been promised long afternoons of swimming and pool parties now had nothing but slimy water and disappointment. It was all anyone could talk about. As if that were not enough, a second problem exploded almost simultaneously. The HOA's beloved flower beds at the subdivision entrance, the ones they spent thousands of dollars maintaining every year, had already begun wilting. Dead, brown flowers greeted visitors instead of cheerful marigolds and petunias. It was the kind of visual slap in the face that even the most oblivious homeowner could not ignore. Blame spread like wildfire. Residents turned on the board with surprising speed, demanding answers, refunds, and solutions. That afternoon, I witnessed a true spectacle. The HOA board called an emergency town hall meeting at the clubhouse. I went, of course. I would not have missed it for the world. The room was packed. Sweaty, angry neighbors filled every chair, some standing along the walls. Karen stood at the front with the board members, papers clutched in her fists, trying to project confidence but failing miserably. She opened the meeting with a statement that they were doing everything in their power to address the water issue and had hired experts to fix it. Immediately, hands shot into the air. People shouted over each other. Why is there no backup plan? Why were we not informed? How can you let this happen? One man, Mr. Langston, a retired engineer, stood up and demanded to know the real source of the water problem. He had spoken to the county water department, he said, and learned that the subdivision did not have direct municipal supply lines. That bombshell set off another wave of shouting. Karen tried to smooth things over, but it was like trying to put out a wildfire with a teacup. That is when I made my move. I stood up quietly and raised my hand. Silence fell surprisingly fast. People recognized me. The guy who lived on the land just outside the subdivision. The guy they had seen mowing fields and fixing fences while they sipped mimosas at brunch. The guy Karen had targeted without a second thought. I walked slowly to the front, every step dragging out the tension in the room. In a calm voice, I explained what had really happened. That I owned the private well. That the HOA had a contract for access. That I had no obligation to provide unlimited water. That cutting my water line was vandalism. I presented the document. I laid it all bare in front of everyone. Karen tried to interrupt. I simply spoke louder, pointing out that they had severed their own water source by trying to force me into compliance with rules that did not even apply to me. Gasps and muttered curses rippled through the crowd. Eyes turned toward Karen, and the fury was tangible. I ended with one final statement. I had the right to keep the water off indefinitely unless and until the HOA corrected their illegal actions and compensated me for the damages they had caused. Until then, their fountains would stay dry, their grass would turn brown, and their once pristine paradise would crumble under the weight of their own stupidity. I walked out to a standing ovation from half the room and a silence heavy enough to crush the other half. This was only the beginning. The drought was just getting started. The next morning brought a kind of quiet that was different from the usual peaceful hum of the neighborhood. It was the sound of defeat setting in. Lawns that once boasted lush, vibrant greens were now patches of yellow and brown, curling up like paper in a fire. The once proud flower beds drooped sadly, and the few remaining sprinklers that tried to sputter to life made weak, choking sounds before giving up completely. The heat of the day bore down relentlessly, and with no hope of irrigation, the entire subdivision began to resemble a desert more than a suburban paradise. I stood at my fence line, coffee in hand, watching as residents trickled out of their houses to stare helplessly at their dying landscape. No one smiled. No one waved. Even the usual morning joggers, always so chipper and chatty, had vanished. What remained was a collective sense of dread, an unspoken understanding that things were only going to get worse. Around noon, Karen and a few of her board members gathered again at the clubhouse, this time in a full-blown panic. I wandered closer, pretending to be out for a casual stroll, just to hear the frantic conversations. They had called in another plumber, and this time a civil engineer too, hoping someone could pull a miracle out of thin air. I heard snippets of their frantic discussion. Maybe we can connect to the county water line. Maybe we can drill a new well. Maybe we can truck in water temporarily. All of it wishful thinking, and all of it absurdly expensive. The nearest county connection was miles away, and laying new pipe through private property would require permits, months of planning, and a mountain of money they did not have. Drilling a new well was an even bigger gamble with no guarantee of success and costs that would bury the HOA financially. Despite the growing crisis, Karen remained stubborn. She paced back and forth, insisting that they could force me to turn the water back on. That surely there was some loophole, some county regulation, something they could use. The desperation in her voice betrayed her words. She knew she was grasping at straws. It was no longer about fixing the problem. It was about saving face. About not admitting that she had single-handedly plunged the entire neighborhood into chaos over a petty vendetta. Meanwhile, the residents were growing restless. The public spaces dried up first. The once grand park at the center of the community, with its towering oak trees and carefully manicured walking trails, was quickly becoming a dust bowl. The playground equipment stood abandoned and baking in the sun, too hot for children to touch. The tennis courts, usually bustling with early morning matches, sat empty and cracked under the unrelenting heat. Homeowners started to realize that without water, their property values were plummeting. What good was $1 million home surrounded by dead lawns and dry fountains? People had moved here for the picturesque lifestyle the HOA had promised, and now that dream was shriveling up like the roses in Mr. Thornby's yard. It did not take long for factions to form within the neighborhood. On one side were the die-hard HOA loyalists, still clinging to the fantasy that Karen could somehow fix this. On the other side were the angry residents who saw the writing on the wall and wanted blood. I watched as groups of neighbors huddled together in driveways and cul-de-sacs, whispering and pointing toward the clubhouse. Signs started appearing in windows demanding Karen's resignation. Angry emails circulated, some of which were leaked to the local news station. Word spread fast, and soon a reporter showed up with a camera crew, eager to cover the spectacular downfall of what had once been the model HOA community. Karen tried to control the narrative, of course. She scheduled an emergency press conference in front of the dead fountain, trying to spin the situation as an unfortunate technical malfunction. But the residents were done with lies. Halfway through her speech, a group of homeowners confronted her live on camera, demanding she explain why the water had been cut off in the first place. One man, a retired lawyer, held up a copy of the original water rights agreement I had given him. He read aloud the part that clearly stated the HOA's dependence on a private water supply and their complete lack of authority over it. The footage was brutal. Karen stammered and fumbled, her carefully rehearsed talking points crumbling in real time. That night, the subdivision's private Facebook group exploded with rage. Dozens of posts called for an emergency vote to dissolve the current board. Residents shared screenshots of emails, photos of dead landscaping, and videos of Karen's disastrous press conference. Someone even made a meme of Karen standing next to the dried-up fountain with the caption "Welcome to Karen Gardens, where dreams go to die." It went viral within the community in a matter of hours. Despite the mounting pressure, the board refused to step down. They announced they would be hiring a legal team to investigate me, claiming I had maliciously shut off the water to extort the HOA. When I received the cease and desist letter from their new attorney, I could hardly contain my laughter. It was written so sloppily and filled with so many false claims that it was practically a gift. I forwarded it to my own lawyer, who was more than happy to respond with a detailed, blistering letter outlining every law and contract the HOA had violated. Still, the board clung to hope. They even attempted to reroute the water by hiring a contractor to dig a makeshift connection late one night. I found out because my trail cameras, installed long ago for wildlife, caught them red-handed. The grainy footage of Karen and 2 board members sneaking around with shovels like cartoon burglars was pure gold. I posted the video anonymously to the community page with a simple caption, "Caught in the act." The reaction was immediate and furious. Residents flooded the HOA with demands for explanations. Within 24 hours, half the board members had resigned in disgrace. Karen remained, of course, too stubborn or too delusional to walk away. But her power was broken. Her supporters were few and far between now, and the vast majority of the neighborhood openly despised her. Meanwhile, the drought continued. Every day without water was a new reminder of her failure, a new nail in the coffin of her crumbling empire. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over the dead lawns and dry fountains, I felt a deep, unshakable satisfaction. They thought they could bully me. They thought they could control me. Instead, they had destroyed themselves, and all I had done was sit back and let it happen. And the best part was that the real consequences were still on the horizon. The legal storm was brewing, and when it hit, it would sweep away whatever pathetic remnants of their power still clung to life. Nightfall brought no peace to the neighborhood that once prided itself on its serenity. Instead, it introduced desperation. Under the cover of darkness, the most foolish members of the HOA decided they would solve their water crisis the old-fashioned way. If they could not legally force me to reopen the well, they would simply find another way to tap into it. I had been expecting this move, because stubbornness mixed with panic made people predictable. They were out of options, out of credibility, and running out of time. So when the rumble of a pickup truck rolled down the narrow path behind my property just past midnight, I was already watching from my porch in the shadows. 3 figures climbed out, flashlights bobbing as they moved toward the area where the main water line used to run. They carried shovels and what looked like some crude piping equipment, clearly hoping to rig a bypass connection. They worked quickly but clumsily, whispering in frantic tones. One slipped in the loose dirt and cursed loud enough for me to hear from where I stood. Their plan was laughably amateurish, the kind of thing a group of teenagers might cook up after a bad idea, fueled by too much soda and bravado. I stayed silent, letting my trail cameras capture every glorious second. I waited until they had dug a shallow trench and started wrestling with the piping before making my move. Stepping out of the shadows, I clicked on a powerful flashlight, flooding the scene with harsh white light. They froze like deer caught on a highway. It was Karen herself, along with 2 of her most loyal board members. The looks on their faces were priceless, a blend of terror, shame, and pathetic defiance. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the night breeze rustling through the dead grass. I broke the silence with a simple question. Trespassing and tampering with a private utility line. Are you sure you want to add those charges to your already impressive list of mistakes? Karen opened her mouth, closed it again, then stumbled through some incoherent explanation about emergency action for the good of the community. I shook my head slowly, savoring the way her words died in the air. There was no community good strong enough to justify breaking the law at midnight on private property. I told them to leave immediately. They hesitated, probably weighing their humiliation against their desperation, but in the end, survival instincts won out. They scurried back to their truck, leaving behind a pathetic mess of disturbed dirt and abandoned tools. I made sure to get clear footage of their faces before they drove off into the night. The next morning, I paid a visit to a private investigator I had on retainer for situations just like this. He specialized in gathering bulletproof evidence for civil cases, and within a few hours, he had compiled everything neatly. Video footage, photographs, timestamps, property surveys, and even copies of the previous cease and desist warnings. It was an airtight case of trespassing, vandalism, and attempted theft. My lawyer nearly rubbed his hands together with glee when I delivered the package to his office. But I was not ready to move immediately. No, patience was key. I wanted the full extent of their stupidity to bake under the sun for a few more days. The neighborhood was already simmering with resentment. If I struck now, it would look like revenge. If I waited, letting the drought suck every last drop of goodwill from Karen and her dwindling supporters, the residents themselves would beg me to finish the job. Sure enough, over the next few days, the situation worsened. The few residents who had managed to keep their lawns alive with desperate bucket brigades gave up. Streets once lined with vibrant landscaping now looked like scenes from an abandoned town. Paint peeled under the heat. Dust-coated driveways. The smell of mildew from the stagnant pool spread like a sickness. No one hosted barbecues anymore. No kids rode bikes. The air itself seemed heavy with frustration and decay. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to self-destruct. Without the majority of the board to prop her up, Karen was flailing. She issued one ridiculous policy after another, desperate to maintain control. Fines for unkempt lawns, citations for failure to maintain curb appeal, threats of liens on properties. It was madness. Residents, already furious, now saw her as a dictator rather than a leader. Lawsuits started brewing. Several homeowners banded together to hire an attorney specializing in HOA abuse cases. Whispers of class action floated through the dusty street. The moment was perfect. My lawyer filed a formal civil suit against Karen and the HOA for trespassing, vandalism, and breach of contract regarding the water supply. Because of the private investigator's work, we had overwhelming evidence. The court filings became public record almost immediately. It was only a matter of hours before copies spread like wildfire through the neighborhood social media group. The reaction was volcanic. Residents demanded Karen's immediate resignation. Meetings devolved into screaming matches. Someone egged the HOA office. Someone else plastered handmade wanted-style posters of Karen's face on light poles, listing her crimes against the community. It would have been sad if it had not been so richly deserved. Adding to the chaos, local news picked up the story. A scandal involving a corrupt HOA, a private well, and a rebellious landowner who had turned off the tap was simply too juicy to ignore. Reporters camped outside the subdivision entrance. Helicopter footage showed aerial views of dead lawns and brown parks, broadcasting the downfall of what had once been a shining example of suburban living. Karen, who had loved media attention when it suited her, now cowered from cameras, dodging interviews and sneaking into meetings through back doors. It was not just reputation damage anymore. The financial impact was catastrophic. Home values plummeted. Buyers backed out of deals. Banks hesitated to approve mortgages for properties within the subdivision. Insurance companies started reconsidering coverage for maintenance-related issues. The HOA's budget, already strained from legal fees and emergency attempts at securing alternate water supplies, teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. And through it all, I remained calm, deliberate, untouchable. I watched from a distance as they crumbled, knowing that every desperate move they made only tightened the noose. I did not need to yell or fight or even lift a finger anymore. Their own arrogance and stupidity had built the gallows. All I had to do was wait for gravity to do its work. By the end of the week, it was clear that the HOA, as it had once existed, was finished. Karen still clung to the illusion of control, but it was a hollow title now, a paper crown sitting atop a collapsing empire. And me, the quiet landowner they thought they could bully, was about to collect the spoils of their downfall, drop by precious drop. The day the lawsuit officially hit Karen and the remnants of the HOA board, the neighborhood all but celebrated. You could feel it in the air, a kind of electric anticipation buzzing through the dusty street. Even the wilted trees seemed to stand a little taller. My lawyer had outdone himself, filing a civil claim so airtight and devastating that even a miracle would not have saved them. Trespassing, vandalism, breach of contract, illegal tampering with private utilities, emotional distress, punitive damages for willful misconduct, it was a masterclass in destruction. And the best part was that the case was already winning in the court of public opinion before it even saw a judge. Residents who once eyed me with suspicion now nodded or waved as I passed. I had gone from outsider to silent hero, the man who had stood his ground against a tyrannical board and won. But I was not finished. Filing the lawsuit was just the beginning. I wanted to ensure that the HOA, and especially Karen, felt the consequences in a way they would never forget. My first step was to file liens against the HOA common properties, the parks, the clubhouse, even the welcome sign at the subdivision entrance. Since they were collectively owned assets and the HOA was facing massive legal exposure, these liens froze their ability to sell, mortgage, or improve anything without addressing the outstanding claims. It sent them into a panic. Karen tried to rally her remaining supporters, but it was like trying to patch a sinking ship with paper towels. Meanwhile, the news coverage intensified. The story had become a sensation, not just locally but regionally. Homeowners' associations were already infamous for their petty tyrannies, and here was a perfect example of one imploding under its own arrogance. Reporters parked outside the neighborhood daily. Helicopters buzzed overhead during the hottest part of the afternoon. Every dry lawn and dead garden became a symbol of Karen's failure, broadcast in high definition to anyone with a television or internet connection. Karen attempted damage control by hosting a town hall meeting at the clubhouse, but barely anyone showed up. Those who did were not interested in listening. They were there to rage. Homeowners shouted over her, waved legal papers in her face, demanded resignations, refunds, compensation for ruined lawns and collapsed home values. Karen, red-faced and trembling, tried to blame me for everything. It backfired spectacularly. One by one, residents stood up and recounted every bad decision she had made over the years, every unfair fine, every power grab. She could not silence them anymore. Her authority, once absolute, was now a punchline. Not long after that disaster of a meeting, Karen's resignation was leaked to the press. She tried to frame it as a brave, selfless decision for the good of the community, but no one bought it. The truth was simple. She was being sued personally for her role in the trespassing and vandalism, and her own legal counsel had advised her to step down immediately before she did any more damage. The remaining board members scrambled to reorganize, but without leadership, funding, or credibility, they were flailing. The homeowners, furious and fed up, called for a complete dismantling of the HOA. During all of this, I quietly prepared the next phase of my plan. Since the HOA could no longer maintain its infrastructure and owed substantial damages, a court ordered a receivership. A neutral party would oversee the dissolution of assets to pay off debt, including mine, which meant the parks, the clubhouse, even the decorative fountains, would go up for sale to the highest bidder. And guess who showed up at the auctions? With little competition and plenty of cash, I acquired every parcel for a fraction of what they were worth. It was poetic. The land they once lorded over, the assets they used to enforce their little empire, now belonged to me. I did not bulldoze anything. I did not wall it off with barbed wire. I simply put up small tasteful signs that read private property, no trespassing. The homeowners could look, but they could not touch. Their kids could no longer play in the parks. Their parties could no longer be held at the clubhouse. The fountains would stay dry, a silent reminder of everything they had thrown away. Meanwhile, the lawsuit continued grinding through the courts. Karen was personally liable for damages, and her insurance refused to cover intentional criminal acts. She had to sell her house to pay her legal fees. Last I heard, she had moved into a small rental unit 2 towns over, far away from the ruined kingdom she had tried so desperately to control. The best part was that I had done almost none of this through aggression. I had not screamed. I had not threatened. I had not even retaliated directly. I had simply stood firm, documented everything, and let their own arrogance collapse their world around them. It was a slow, relentless form of justice, the kind that leaves permanent scars instead of loud, flashy victories. Some homeowners eventually approached me, asking if they could lease back the park spaces or the clubhouse for event. I agreed, for a hefty fee and strict rules. Payment in advance. Insurance required. No exceptions. If they wanted a slice of the paradise they had once abused, they would have to pay for it dearly. It was not about the money. It was about the principle. They needed to remember every time they held a birthday party or an anniversary celebration on what used to be public land that it now belonged to the man they tried to destroy. By the end of the year, the subdivision had stabilized into something new. Smaller. Humbled. Some homeowners moved out, unable to stand the reminders. Others stayed, their pride swallowed along with their dreams of effortless suburban living. As for me, I enjoyed my mornings in peace again. I watered my garden without fear of interruption, my fields greener than ever, my wells full and flowing under my control. They had cut my water line, thinking they could starve me into submission. Instead, they had drowned themselves in their own arrogance. And I, the quiet man at the edge of town, stood dry and untouched while their empire turned to dust. The final blow came not with a bang but with a whimper, a slow realization that the old order was never coming back. Months had passed since Karen's fall, since the water shutoff, since the lawsuits and auctions. Life in the subdivision had shifted into something far quieter, far more subdued. The people who had once proudly flown HOA flags and boasted about their spotless lawns now kept their heads down, mowing their brown patches with resigned acceptance. No more newsletters bragging about community pride. No more patrols by self-important board members issuing citations for mailbox colors or Christmas lights left up too long. The place was stripped of its old swagger, and in that hollow space something more genuine began to take root. I spent most mornings working on my property, tending to the garden, maintaining the fences, repairing old irrigation lines. The quiet was different now. It was not the stiff, uncomfortable silence that came from living under the constant surveillance of the HOA. It was a real quiet, the kind where people minded their own business and neighbors waved not out of obligation but because they genuinely meant it. I liked it better this way. The land seemed to breathe easier too, as if it had been holding its breath for years under the HOA's suffocating grip. One crisp Saturday morning, a knock came at my door. I opened it to find a small group of residents standing there, hats in hand, looking more sheepish than angry. They were some of the ones who had fought hardest against Karen's insanity once they realized how deep the damage ran. They asked if I would be willing to talk, just talk, about maybe finding a way forward. No pressure, no demands, no trick. I invited them in, served them coffee, and listened as they spoke. They wanted to know if there was a way to create a community association that was voluntary, with no authority to fine, no power to dictate personal property choices, just a simple group that could manage the shared spaces like the parks and the clubhouse. They did not want to make the same mistakes again. They understood that if they wanted access to the areas I now owned, it would be on my terms. It was not lost on any of them that I held all the cards. I could have laughed them out the door, could have charged outrageous fees, or simply refused altogether. But as I listened, I realized that most of these people were not my enemies. They were victims too, trapped under Karen's iron thumb until everything collapsed. After a long pause, I agreed. Not immediately. Not without safeguards. But I agreed to negotiate a leasing arrangement. They would have access to the parks and clubhouse for a nominal fee, strictly regulated, with clear contracts outlining responsibilities. No authoritarian nonsense. No micromanagement. If anyone tried to revive the old HOA mentality, the lease would be terminated immediately. They accepted these terms without hesitation, almost gratefully. It felt strange sitting across the table from them, drafting up new documents that redefined the relationship between my land and their lives. Strange, but right. This time, there was no arrogance, no assumptions of superiority. Just people trying to find a way to live peacefully side by side. It was more than I had expected. more than they deserved at first. But time and humility had a way of softening even the hardest grudges. The first community event under the new agreement was a simple one. A potluck picnic in the park. No HOA banners. No board members standing stiffly in khakis and polo shirt. Just families bringing folding chairs, coolers, and mismatched dishes full of homemade food. Kids played tag among the newly green grass. The dead flower beds had been cleaned out and replanted with simple, sturdy blooms that could survive a little neglect. No awards for best lawn. No judgmental glances at scuffed shoes or chipped paint. Just laughter, music, and neighbors being neighbors. I kept a respectful distance at first, watching from my porch with a beer in hand, letting them have their moment. After a while, a few people waved me over. I hesitated, then crossed the road to join them. They clapped me on the back, handed me a plate of food, and welcomed me without ceremony. It was not a hero's welcome. I was not their savior. I was just another person who lived here now, a part of the landscape as much as the oak trees and dusty trails. As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, I thought back to how it all began. A single act of arrogance. A single cut waterline. A single stubborn man who refused to be bullied. It could have been a story about bitterness, about revenge pursued so fiercely that it burned everything to ash. But it was not. In the end, it was a story about resilience, about the slow, stubborn work of reclaiming dignity from the wreckage, about finding peace not through dominance but through understanding boundaries and respecting them. I still owned the water. The well was mine, silent and deep beneath the earth, a constant reminder of how easily the balance could shift if respect gave way to entitlement again. But for now there was trust, tentative but growing. And that was enough. Weeks later, the final paperwork came through. The old HOA was officially dissolved, the last legal nails driven into its coffin. There were no grand speeches. No ceremonies. Just a quiet posting on the community bulletin board, a simple statement that the HOA no longer existed, replaced by a voluntary association under a long-term lease agreement with private landowners. My name was listed simply as property manager, not ruler, not dictator, just a man with rights respected at last. Life settled into a new rhythm. I planted more trees along the property lines, ones that would grow strong and shade the walking trails in years to come. I expanded the garden, added beehives, started building a small orchard. Every morning, I drew water from my well without fear, knowing it flowed on my terms now. Every evening, I watched the sun set over a neighborhood that had learned the hard way what real community meant. The subdivision was not perfect. It never would be. But it was better. And sometimes better was enough. Sometimes better was everything. In the end, they thought they could control the man who controlled their water. They thought wrong. And when the dust settled, I was still standing, still growing, still thriving. Quiet, patient, and just a little bit amused at how sweet victory tasted when it came slowly, surely, and completely on your own terms. If you want, I can now also prepare a short story description or thumbnail text matching the story style for you. Would you like that too?